listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good, good. I feel like we could rename the podcast to Identity at the Center plus Ransomware plus Zero Trust plus Multicloud IAM. What do you think?
Well, I think it's just at the center of all of those things. So I'm not in favor of re-architecting our logo again.
Yeah, that was a major effort, right? So maybe we'll just keep it as Identity at the Center, but it feels like these are the recurring themes that pretty much week after week we keep talking about.
Well, this is very much kind of like what you've said in the past is, this show is sometimes a little bit of a time capsule of what's been going on in the world. And, the year is 2021, we're getting towards the end of it, and those things are still prevalent. Ransomware has continued to be a problem, around the world, and things and strategies like Zero Trust have evolved to try and, mitigate some of that. And who knows, maybe in a couple of years, we'll be looking at back in this and say, remember when we had to use passwords? Oh, those guys were hilarious.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping for that day. So, but I think, these are be good conversations that will reoccur with our guests today.
Yeah, it's not like you can just kind of punt these problems and put your head in the sand and say, okay, well, we're not going to worry about it for a couple of years. Like, these are things that people have to deal with now. So, hopefully some of these conversations kind of spark ideas, thoughts, plans, actions, wishes, dreams, maybe of where IAM programs and, by extension, maybe InfoSec programs go to try and alleviate some of these issues. So, I'm all for it. I think, it's just something that's what's hot now. We'll try to continue to stay relevant and talk about whatever is hot in the next, 6, 12, however long this thing keeps going.
Well, I think it's also, we devote a lot of our podcasts talking about people getting into this industry and why this industry is so much fun. And the thing is, like, these new issues keep evolving, and we've got to figure out frameworks to kind of solve for them. I mean, multi-cloud IAM is like the pressing issue that I feel like every organization from 1,000 users all the way up, they're all dealing with multi-cloud. It's a paradigm shift in terms of how they manage identity. Obviously, we've had a lot of people on to talk about how they favor approaching that, but I just feel like it's an issue where I still don't have in my mind the one rock solid framework that is going to solve it. But that's pretty much what I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about.
You need to get better sleep. I don't know anybody who you shouldn't be having nightmares about multi-cloud. Anyway, why don't we get to our topic here? Because, the cool thing about this show is we do get to talk to, cool folks that are in the identity space, people that have made a life and living out of it and have really kind of contributed to it. So I'd like to introduce Morey Haber. He's a chief security officer at BeyondTrust, got a long history in identity. Welcome to the show, Morey.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, so thanks for spending a few minutes here with us. Before we go any further, just to kind of level set for the folks who are listening and for Jim and I as well, how did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose, or did identity choose you?
Oh, identity definitely chose me. I started in the security space doing vulnerability management, and even before then, doing network management, and security kept on causing my network management solutions to flake out, cause issues, have problems, things of that nature. And from vulnerability management, when you consider that the two best ways to compromise a system are vulnerability exploit combination or stealing privileges or hacking of privileges is always tied to an account and an identity in terms of relationship. Identity found me, and here we are.
Well, congratulations for that. And that's led to the absolute pinnacle of your career being on our podcast, which we all know is really what we're all in it for. You've written several books, in this space. I think you've got 3 under your belt so far and a 4th one in progress. I guess tell us a bit about what those books are, just at a very high level. And maybe if you can share what the 4th one coming up might be about, that would be cool too.
Cool. Yeah, so the first book that I wrote was Privileged Attack Vectors, covering privileged access management. And last year I did a second edition of it, basically bringing it up to date. And it's scary. I could actually revise it every year and it still wouldn't be up to date because of how fast the industry is changing. The second book I wrote was Asset Attack Vectors, covering vulnerabilities and exploits. And it doesn't go down into the details of vulnerabilities themselves, but it's how you effectively build a vulnerability management program for your organization, including simple things like what is an appropriate email to send to someone if you don't have change control, that you want to explain to them how to fix a particular problem. That book is actually being used as a textbook in several universities to teach vulnerability management as a part of their curriculum. So I'm really proud of that. And then the last book, Identity Attack Vectors, came out about 2 years ago. It's been highly rated as a source of how to understand the entire identity governance and identity access management space. It was co-written with the CTO from SailPoint, Darren Rolls, and really basically solidified my feet into identity, not only privileged, moving forward. And then the book that's in the works is called Cloud Attack Vectors. Similar to the Asset Attack Vector book, it's not going to tell you how to, hack something, but it's going to give you all the strategies, mitigations, and concerns of building anything in the cloud, whether it's your own solution, whether it's multi-cloud, and the concerns that you have. Because after all, it's not your computer; you're leasing it from somebody else.
I feel like you're coming up with kind of like this almost this framework or structure for attack vectors. You've got cloud, identity, asset, privileged. We got to come up with like a cool acronym or something and call it like, the Morey Haber approach to attack vectors or something like that. It's all about
I,
marketing.
I'll give that to my publisher. My publisher was the one who came up with the title, actually, and we've stuck with it all the way through. And in the third book, Identity Attack Vectors, we built a model that actually covers asset, identity, and privilege as to how almost any hack can occur. So you can classify anything that's compromised in one of those three ways. So the cloud is just another implementation of it. But yeah, framework maybe, concepts more likely.
So how do you keep, I guess the challenge for me would be how do you keep these books from becoming history books, considering the evolution and kind of the constant change in not just identity, but information security at large?
It is an interesting problem. That's why I did a second edition of Privileged Attack Vectors. I don't think I'll revisit Asset unless there's a major change in the vulnerability patch landscape. Granted, there are new technologies, agentless technologies, side scanning technologies for it, but then vulnerability management programs are pretty static. Identity is changing a lot, so that might be something I'll revisit. But the core concepts of joiner, mover, leaver, the core concepts of authentication, knowing something, having something to prove authentication before authorization, not confusing the two, those haven't changed too much. But there are concepts like passwordless. There are concepts of identities in the clouds and entitlements and principles that might warrant a change or an update at some point. But not yet. We want to see how things stabilize across the board.
Right. I mean, you constantly get into the state of kind of like rewriting and constantly putting edits and things like that into it.
Yeah, literally in writing this book, we'll go visit it again and we make some changes and changes and changes and new definitions or a new concept or making sure that even the reference points are up to date because the industry, the market, the attack vectors, they're changing so fast that, yeah, even when the book is published, which we're targeting for beginning of Q2 2022, there might be sections that are already outdated. There's just nothing you can do about it.
Right. And you also do some work with a few different nonprofits like the IDSA, who we've had Julie on the show several times, and some other folks in there, the Identity Defined Security Alliance, then also the cybersecurity nonprofit. What are some of the things that you're working on with both of those organizations?
So for IDSA, we got heavily into Identity Security Month. We did a week of it with some blogs and postings, and that has been a great team to work with. And what's so special about that organization is it is competitors, and it is friends, and it is partners, and it is people that I've personally known through many years of working together, basically shedding, hey, I work for X and you work for Y, we shouldn't talk. Coming up with the best strategies for identity, concepts, frameworks, recommendations that every company should put forward. And then the companies can work on their products on the side. That's fine. But it is designed to be agnostic, and that has been critical to their success. And like I said, just a great group of people with a ton of great knowledge and publications. CSNP I've only been involved with for about a year and a half now. And their goal is diversity and security and bringing security knowledge to anyone, and not only security professionals. You could be in any department, you could still be in higher education. And that has been a really good vehicle to communicate experience, knowledge, and also to meet people. So we do monthly podcasts, A Day in the Life of a CISO with my counterpart, Bob Henderson. And we basically have our Rolodex open pulling CISOs, whether it's the CISO from the NFL, from Wendy's, uh, people from overseas, just basically telling us how they got into the career, how they're doing, very much like this conversation, but with a goal of imparting knowledge to anyone that wants to do better in cybersecurity or wants to one day themselves be a CISO. So a great avenue out.
I'd also like to mention that we had Darren Rolls, the South Point CTO that you mentioned, on episode 53. So if anybody wants to go back and listen, that was I'd say one of our all-time best episodes. So definitely wanted to go back and check on. Um, I think, Maury, one of the things that I find interesting is understanding how people explain what they do when they have a very in-depth job in the IT space in information security, and kind of explain what they do as to the man on the street. I'd like to kind of take an angle on that. And, I'm on the tip of the tongue of the man on the street when it comes to InfoSec these days is ransomware and what's happening with ransomware, especially with some of the major breaches that have taken place last year and this year. I'm wondering, how do you go about explaining that to people, and kind of what are some of the highlights that, if you're trying to really let somebody understand the impact of ransomware, what are the things that you make sure that they understand?
Well, jokingly, when we get introduced to friends, family, my children's parents of my children, they ask what I do. I tell them I'm a florist, because as soon as I say I'm a chief security officer or something else, who knows where the conversation is going to go. So it's kind of like one of my best lines. What do you do? I'm a florist. Oh, you make arrangements? Sure, right? You always have to gauge who you're talking to when you answer that question. And that's why I always lead with a joke of that nature. Um, it, it's difficult. Sometimes you come across other people that really understand cybersecurity. You can say you're a chief security officer, you could say you're an author, you can say a lot of things, but if they don't understand it or barely know how to use their phone, it literally just goes right over their head. So I don't have a great answer to that question, but I always try to feel them out, or at least maybe ask what they do first before I dive into it. But if I do get into it, and it does happen frequently enough. Yes, I run security for a cybersecurity company, and we specialize on privileges and identity and access. And, you know, what do you have any questions, or what can I help with? But it's not an easy conversation just to have with, hey, guy next door, what does he do? He's a veterinarian. You don't know anything about this space, nothing at all. He could tell me how to do oral surgery on a dog all day long. But when you talk to him about identities, he completely glosses over.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. One of the things I think about with ransomware, though, that, I mean, really seems to get people engaged is if you can talk about kind of real world examples where you have a situation where an organization got their Active Directory owned, and the hacker, more or less, took control of their business and shut down their business for a week. I mean, that's catastrophic, right? Um, I think that data breaches, it's kind of the old story that people get. And I think from an organization standpoint, it really depends on, you know, a couple things. One is, how valuable is the data that you got? And second is, how much can I trust that even if I pay you, that data is not going to end up on the dark web anyway. But in terms of, if you've got my Active Directory encrypted and I can't do business anymore, now you got me. And I think people tend to kind of like understand that and like, wow, what you do is very important.
It is. I never go to that extreme with them, but I also go to the conversation if they do know. And several people I know, surprisingly, they're in this space or they're doing something similar. They understand that if you ever get into Active Directory, you own any of the domain accounts, you're not fixing it. You're starting over. You're not even restoring from backups in many cases. But what's kind of scary about those conversations, and I've had a few of them in recent years, are companies that can't. There is no way to restore their environment. They've cleaned it up the best they can. They've put in additional monitoring and controls, but starting over was not an option due to their size, their complexity, or other issues that they may have had. So, yeah, if you get on to the level of AD domain accounts, consider it a game over event. You should reload. If it's just ransomware in an isolated segment, yeah, you may have data exfiltrated or be a part of an extortion scam. You got to weigh that risk. But ultimately, um, anything that's been infected, you should reload. You can't trust the threat actors holding you ransom. You get your data back, you consider all of those machine poisoned, and you remove them and reload them. And in some cases, some organizations I've worked with, that hardware is now disposable if it can be replaced because you don't necessarily know how deep they could have gotten in. And in many modern cases, without secure boot and other technologies, that thing could still be sitting around in the BIOS. It's really hard to know.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really depends on the level at which they infected. So I think kind of another thing that I've noticed is, it's just like with anything that happens to big companies, there's a segment of society, a man on the street kind of attitude, which is, oh, they have insurance. And I think that's even kind of leaked into the cyber world where people think, well, you've got cyber insurance. So yeah, you may have had to pay a $10 million ransom, but your insurance company's just going to pay that. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is there any validity there? Because if insurance companies are paying these mega ransoms out, I've got to think that that's a business model that is in jeopardy.
It's a loss leader. Look, before we started the conversation, we were joking about our kids and things like that, and family members buying a brand new home did their walkthrough today, but it didn't come with appliances. You didn't even they didn't even know that when they bought the house, and now they're scrambling to see if they can get appliances in time. Cyber insurance is not much different. It is your last resort backup, and anybody that thinks it's going to be the first thing that happen, first your first line of defense, is grossly mistaken. And cyber insurance companies are now going, look, we're not making as much money as we thought here, could make here, et cetera. Like selling a house that's stripped down without the appliances and going, look, if you want them, here's a little extra money, or go find them yourself. So what's happened is the cybersecurity questionnaires for insurance are asking very poignant questions about your internal security practices in terms of, do you have admin rights removed? Are you doing this? Are you doing Y, etc. And if you're not answering them correctly, when they go to underwriting, they're either raising the rates or dropping you altogether because for them, it is a business. So you've seen people, cyber insurance companies, exit the business because there's too much risk versus reward. And you've seen those questionnaires become very poignant, and you've seen the rates go up significantly. So, hey, you're committed to go buy this house, and you realize, you know what? We're just not going to include something that could be an increased deductible, that could be an increase in certain services. Look, we'll cover your endpoints, but the stuff in the cloud, you didn't answer well. If you have a ransomware attack there, sorry. So it's become a very interesting problem for businesses to stay insured, and even more so because many of the contracts that they're signing with clients or other providers require it. So you have to basically weigh, what can I do in terms of mitigating those threats versus the cost of the insurance, because most likely you're contractually obligated.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you just said around um, the ability to be insured. I think that's an interesting point. Is if you are repeatedly attacked and compromised, I would imagine at some point, just like if you're a poor driver of a vehicle, people may not want to insure you, or you're really putting yourself in a financial burden to try and get insurance. I guess, is there a certain point where it's like, okay, yeah, this company just is uninsurable, and it's not tenable for organizations to kind of think about that from that perspective?
Oh, absolutely. So think about some of the recent names that have been in the news. Do you think they're able to get cyber insurance? Question mark, full stop, however you want to look at it. Probably not. And many of them, even though they've patched the vulnerabilities, still have inherently bad security practices that the tools were, designed 20 years ago and use God rights across all the systems, have discovery accounts that need admin rights. Hard to believe. But you know what? Replacing those tools is hard. Is there better technology? Maybe not. So, yeah, if you've been in the news or if you've been a victim, I would say that those are probably very difficult organizations to insure, if not at all.
And if they are, they're probably trying to take a look at the environment and basically just doing an assessment to say, okay, if we did insure you, how could me as the insurer not put myself at risk of having to do this massive payout? And I think that's where you mentioned a little about the tooling, right? There's identity tooling, there's other non-identity types of tools, cybersecurity, et cetera. And it's probably a combination of kind of all these things that pull together. But what I want to focus is on here, especially considering the work you do with BeyondTrust, is where does privileged access management fit into a proper, you know, information security slash identity program from your perspective?
Well, let's tie that into cyber insurance, and I'll answer it in a continuous stream. If you think about cyber insurance for a minute, for when one of those name brand companies that was recently breached that services the MSP market, and they've sold that software to thousands of MSPs. Is that MSP insurable now? From what we have seen, very difficult to insure them because they are so dependent on a company that was breached and had bad security practices, and the MSP deployed them. Now, think about that in terms of what you just asked. We're taking a piece of software that has known flaws. It's being used in a single tenant or multi tenant deployment where the accounts, the username password, may even be the same to administer multiple companies in that MSP if it was not properly deployed, let alone the privileges or the admin rights needed to help administrate them. So if you look at this fan out scenario of privileged accounts are your most sacred accounts. They should never be shared. They should always be unique. They should always be protected. They should always be under multi-factor. We could argue very easily that all standard accounts should have multi-factor as well. And now apply it to a business that used a tool that inherently doesn't follow those best practices, and you're using an MSP. Some places can't be insured because you know what? They're optimized to make money and they just rolled it out to handle everyone. And now you have this problem of privilege and identity accounts through all of these small businesses or even medium-sized businesses that leverage that MSP. That same problem happens in people running standalone every day. Shared admin account, no segregation of duties. We did not implement standard user. We're not following least privilege, on and on and on and on. And when it comes to that privileged account being compromised, it's just as bad as if the MSP themselves was compromised and they were able to replicate the attack across everyone. And unfortunately, that's what we just recently saw.
And I think you touch on a point there where people are basically taking shortcuts, right, to try and be able to make privileged access management processes be smoother, less red tape, which I think is sort of a historical perspective on where PAM has been in the past, where I got to jump through all these hoops to do the thing that I used to be able to do just to telnet or SSH to a system or whatever it may be. But I don't think it necessarily has to be as bad as people are saying. Any tips that you can give to folks who are thinking about the user experience for their administrators to kind of keep them on the path that they should be going? And essentially, it's how do you deploy PAM in a way that admins don't hate it?
Well, that's the hard part. And we can take the MSP out of the equation, but it also applies to them too. If you take the proper definition of privileged access management, it is password management with session recording, rotation, etc., much more than your last passes of the world. But in recent months, the definition from the analyst community has expanded to endpoint, the removal of admin rights, and the elevation of applications. It also is applied to CIM, which is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, and Secrets Management. So it's actually 4 categories now. But how do you make it easier for the end user? So let's take password management. If the workflow in a traditional password management approach is to go to a website, log in, find your system, get its current password, copy it, and paste it into your session, your admins are going to hate you. It's too many extra steps, especially for someone that is using a lot of administrative systems per day. And the rotation of passwords is frequent. You can't copy them down. You're not allowed to write them down. Every time you put it in your clipboard, it's probably going to rotate, or if you have policy to blow the clipboard away after a few minutes, etc. What you want to do is say, look, what tool do you want to use? Putty, Royal, Devolutions, I don't care. Use your native tools. Use what you like as an admin or someone that needs administrative rights. And when you click on your save session, PAM is completely seamless behind the hood. It makes the call, it gets the password, it gets you through the proxy. Session recording and everything else is transparent to you. And then everything that you want to do with your favorite tool just works. But you're never exposed to the username. You're never exposed to the password. You may have 3 to 5 seconds more of time for all of the mechanism to work behind the hood, do the logging, start the session, etc. But that's tolerable. That's not going, hey, I'm starting a process and going to get a cup of coffee, or I've got 10 new mouse clicks for every single session. That's how password management should be. The second piece is endpoint. The traditional approach for endpoint is give everybody a secondary local administrator account, an ex-admin account, and when they need to run something, UAC pops up or pops up on a Mac and says, enter your username and password or touch ID and let it go. That's bad because there's still a local admin account that you know the password for. The way to make it faster for an end user is that they are a standard user, but using PAM technology and preferably zero trust technology. When a rule is matched in a policy that says they're allowed to add a printer, they want to run an updater, they're allowed to do an installer, the application itself becomes elevated through a variety of methods, but the end user doesn't have to type in a username and password, it just works. So you've actually increased security by removing their admin rights and increased efficiency because they never get UAC or a pop-up. It just works because they've been allowed to based on policy. The same concepts apply to secrets and KIM, but the whole point here is there's technology ways of doing privileged access, relating it to the identity governance chain so that they become more efficient and transparent. And actually people like using it because they don't get the pop-ups. They don't have the clicks to do these best practices.
I can certainly empathize that just because I'm constantly trying out new hardware, laptops, etc. And I'm going through my standard install and everything. So I'm constantly seeing Microsoft UAC pop-ups. I'm constantly, getting the Mac OS pop-ups. It'd be nice to have that kind of be more automated, but I get why they're there. You mentioned something around KIM, cloud identity entitlement management. And I think this is still a relatively kind of newer area when it comes to privilege access. And we've seen some tools in that space. And I think multi-cloud is something that a lot of organizations really kind of struggle with managing the permissions across those. What are some of your thoughts around how do you address privileged access from a multi-cloud perspective?
Well, I think we have to first go back to what you guys were talking about in the beginning, identity at the center. When we think about identities in each of the cloud providers, they mean something different. Azure AD versus an IAM user versus et cetera, et cetera. They're all different. And then underneath that, you have entitlements. So we've got to make sure we understand the definitions between entitlements, privileges, users, and principals. I know it's a lot, and people generally just muddle them all together. But entitlements is the concept of I'm able to do something. It's a very high level abstract that you are able to do something. The privileges are the rights to do it. The rights are the individual settings, file, directory, etc. And the principal is the governance of all of it. So when we think about an entitlement across Amazon, AWS, Google, they're different. They don't mean the same thing because those cloud environments are different. So when you think about something in the KIM space, a product or strategy, it's taking those entitlements and making recommendations or lining them up like a master cross-reference database of saying, this is how you create an instance here. This is what those entitlements mean. This is what it means here. This is where it means here. And then formulating the recommendations to administrators so that they know that, yep, this is a creation. This is a drop. This is a delete. That's the terminology, and this is what they mean per, but putting it in a standard interface with a standard language so everyone can use. I kind of equate it to ICQ. If you've been around for a while, you guys know exactly what it is. It's a single user interface where you can get all your chat messages from every provider in a single place. Well, you know what? We lost that. We now have Teams, we now have Slack, we have Signal. We don't have a good program that brings it all together so that you can have one interface to do all your IM. That's gone. KIM is the same thing. Show me all your entitlements, privileges, rights, and everything in one place. Give me a standard way of looking at it. Give me a standard way of performing an attestation and certification for identity. And then actually say, you know what? They've got too many privileges. Let me go make that change. A new identity has been created. Let me go fix it. So if you're in a single cloud, stick with your native provider. No big deal. But when you're in a multi-cloud, KIM is the way for you to get all of those identities in sync, and probably one of the biggest bang for your bucks in the market today to get started on that.
Do you think that this is an opportunity for some sort of standardization when it comes to cloud vendors? I think of the example, between AWS, GCP, and Azure kind of being the top three, and they all kind of do things differently. We've seen this approach in the authentication world where there have been standards that are interoperable, kind of developed, OpenID, OAuth, SAML, things like that. Is there an opportunity here for some sort of, common language or approach to managing cloud infrastructure that might be beneficial for really kind of the security, space at large?
There might be. The closest that I can think of is SCIM, which is an identity-based protocol using XML for exchanging identity information. But I don't think the standards are even close yet. And this might be controversial, arguable. But when you look at the fundamentals for, let's just say, Azure and AWS, we're not dealing with the same type of systems. It goes back to the joke, hey, Dad, what are clouds made of? Linux servers, mostly Linux servers. You're not going to find that on the Windows side. So we're dealing with different types of resources, different types of instances, whether we're dealing with containers, whether we've implemented Kubernetes. The entitlements are going to be more specific to what you can create, what you can manage, let alone going to Azure where you're going to find Windows being the fundamental, and then all of the entitlements associated with Windows in itself. So yeah, add, create, drop, delete, sure, standard CRUD type of approaches. But when it comes to the uniqueness at the cloud provider, I think we're far way off on standardization, unfortunately.
So, Maury, we've talked about that hit list I started out, ransomware, zero trust, multi-cloud. We talked about ransomware. We talked about multi-cloud. Now, zero trust. I know you have an interesting perspective on this. We talked about it before. I'd like you to share it with everybody in terms of, I can't, for my money, zero trust is like the best answer we have in terms of how to prevent or reduce the risk of getting ransomware. So, what is zero trust? You look, you don't have to go through the kind of the basics of zero trust. I think most of our listeners know what zero trust is, but it's not, you go out and buy a product. So, how do you recommend organizations approach zero trust? Is there a framework that you recommend?
Yeah, zero trust, and I'll emphasize one thing, zero trust is not a product. It is an old strategy that's been given a name, formalized, and something that we all can do today and we should do today in our businesses. But when you look at the references for zero trust from vendors, you're going to get confused really fast. And I'll put a full stop there. Don't look to a vendor to give you the definition. What you want to do is go to NIST 800-207. It's an easy to read government publication. And I say easy to read, it really is. It will give you multiple architectures and tenants, traits that make what a zero trust solution really should have. And once you understand that and read that, then you can pretty much go, you know what? I'm already doing a lot of these things, and I'm willing to bet you are. Now, what can I do to polish it to make it actually something that I can put a label on and represent to the rest of my business, or even write a paper on it if you were so inclined? But it really all starts with one fundamental: identity. It is all about the identity that is requesting authentication and authorization, knowing everything about it in terms of attributes and being able to monitor it in real time for anything that is inappropriate and adjusting in real time what can be done and how it should be done. If you can get those basic tenets right, you're gold. The biggest piece that people forget, and I can only stress this enough, is zero trust is designed to be perimeterless. You cannot use your IDS firewalls, ACLs, everything else that you use for network security to build a zero trust architecture. This makes it complicated for implementing on legacy technology or for peer-to-peer technology. They're just not compatible. So there are places that you just have to almost back off. But if you do have an environment that's pretty static and it does need those controls, NIST 800-207 even has an accommodation called an enclave environment, much similar to, let's say, a PCI network zone or something that you would do for PCI. If you can define the enclave really tight and basically make it its own bubble, its own segment, then apply zero trust to that, it still can be achieved. But you still got to keep into consideration that you really should not be using any perimeter controls in making it work. With that in mind, the identity is what it starts with. Whoever, wherever it comes from, knowing all the attributes about it, monitoring it, and then authenticating against the resource you need.
I'll admit that was a bit of a leading question. I knew you were going to go down the route of NIST 800-207, but I think it's important, right? I mean, that it's not a product, right? Don't just go out and say, how can I get zero trust? I can buy one or two products and throw them in my environment. Here's another leading question, right? Because I know we're kind of running up on time, and so I want to get right to it, which is you told us you could share a story about a non-endpoint based ransomware attack. And so I was hoping you could kind of share that story.
Yeah. So um, can't got to protect the names of the innocent, right? Of course. But most people associate ransomware with I got a phishing attack, I didn't patch a vulnerability, my server got compromised, it was an end of life device that I can't remove. Great, right? That's what we hear in the news. But ransomware is evolving. We already know about the extortion aspects of it, where your data is being stolen and you're getting the double extortion compromise. Give me money to essentially unencrypt your password and then more money, and I won't release it. But we're still talking about the endpoint. We're still talking about phishing. We're still talking about servers. Now think of other infrastructure that could be subject to ransomware. So recently, I had an experience with a hypervisor in the cloud from a third party that had unpatched vulnerabilities. And actually, they were 0 days. So I shouldn't say unpatched. It was a true 0 day where the management system for it was compromised. The ransomware itself, instead of destroying the hypervisor, actually shut down each of the instances and encrypted the instances. So the entire hypervisor and all of its runtime were basically shut down. What this meant was the provider of that system was a cloud provider. They were hosting specific applications for a specific use case. And the problem is look, the data is out there. It's from multiple people. How sensitive is it? Can it be extracted? And we're now talking about a ransomware attack specifically against something that was traditionally not possible. Well, that 0 day has since been patched. Those instances, a decrypt key was found without paying the ransom, but we still had interesting problems with data disclosure, what was in it, etc. A lot of forensics to prove data was not exfiltrated, a lot of forensics, but that helped with privacy regulations, etc. So from a ransomware standpoint, as the story goes, again, protecting the innocent, don't think it's just your endpoints. It can be anything that you got hanging on the internet. You want to make sure ports are never opened that should not be. Even management ports that you might think, oh, no problem, those should always be redirected to the appropriate resources or behind the proper 2FA. Because if something like that can happen and basically take out a cloud service provider and their running instances, it really could happen to anyone.
That sounds like a real nightmare scenario.
It was fun.
Untangle that.
Yeah, this isn't a story, guys, that I'm hearing, from the left side. This is a personal thing we, had to deal with. It was not my company's data. It was not anything that, someone should go alarmed. Why wasn't this reported? But it's real world, pure and simple.
Right. So, I know we're running up here on time, but what are, any top tips you've got for CISOs and other folks in the identity space that are listening? What can they be doing now to reduce, risk, exposure, whatever it may be from whether it's ransomware or really, anything really from a credential abuse? Is it training? Is it tools? Is it having, the proper incident response? Is it everything? What else?
It's everything and anything. And there's really, I could say go do asset management, go back to basics, prove your fundamentals. But my number one tip that I have found in the last 3 years of, in being a CISO, coming up from my environment is not what most CISOs think about. My management team will joke, hey, you run in a herd, find your herd, find your peers, go talk to other CISOs, whether that's through events, whether it's through Slack channels, whether it's through Twitter. Find other CISOs because they are your best resources to go, yep, seen that. Nope, haven't. I have the same problem. Maybe we'll go talk to someone together. When you have a trusted set of peers to help bounce ideas off of, you'll find that your stress levels go down tremendously because you don't feel alone on an island going, how do I solve this and not? I mentioned Darren earlier, trusted advisor, friend. If I got something that's out of the blue, we just, chat about it. It's just one of those things, as well as a variety of others. For example, how do you do antivirus in an cloud environment when you can't load agents? How do you do it in real time? Agents are needed real time. There are API technologies that can do it as a snapshot, but what if you need to do real time? You could start going through the analysts, you could start going through media companies, but in many cases, it's just a ping to some of your friends and see if they've ever come across it or found a way to do it. And you can trust them. Yeah, we looked at this person, we looked at that. This worked really well. This was great. But I'll tell you what, the cost and setup were hard. That type of reference is huge. So my best recommendation for my peers, if you're not already embracing a CISO community of some sort, try. It really will make a difference.
That is great advice. And I think here's another added value is that it's probably cheaper. It's probably a cup of coffee, a bottle of bourbon, maybe a nice dinner versus, going to the expense of proper analysts and things like that. But yeah, that's a good one.
It is. And sometimes it's just a Thursday night with a scotch. It's really all it is.
I think a lot of CISOs are in the same boat. And I think that's one of the things that is, cybersecurity generally is not secret sauce for an organization. Might be a little bit different if you're in the security space and there are obviously specific tools, right? I'm sure you're not going off and talking to your CISO friends around, hey, this is how BeyondTrust works, right? And stuff like that. But I'm sure you are sharing, similar type of approaches for general cybersecurity with each other and seeing what worked and things like that. So that makes a ton of sense to me.
It does. And you know what? You might be surprised. We do share tool names. We won't share our controls or implementation, but we will share our strategies. And many times, it's this tool did this, that tool did that. But recently, 6 months to a year, everything is coming back to identity. We're not deploying any tools that do not associate, correlate events, data sets back to a user account or identity, because without it, you can't track it, especially if it's an insider problem, contractor problem, outsourcing problem. And all of those are incredibly relevant with a work from anywhere environment because everybody's working from everywhere. So how do we know that the activity was this identity from where versus just some stray event in the log?
Right. Well, you've been really generous with your time, and I want to start to wrap things up here to respect that. But I know that you are a home improvement type of guy. Sound pretty handy based on some conversations we have. I want to ask you a non-identity question here, and that is, what is the best or worst home improvement project that you've worked on?
All right. So I'll ask you, which would you like to know, best or worst?
Well, I think people always want to hear the worst, so let's start there.
Okay. The worst goes back about 20 years ago. I had purchased a new home, and we noticed a little bit of wood rot underneath a bathroom window. And I'm like, you know what? I'll just pull out the sill with a crowbar, pop in a new one, shouldn't be a problem. Well, you pull out the sill and you realize, wow, it goes pretty deep. You start taking off stucco and you start taking off the wall and you find out it's a wood frame house. It goes pretty deep. Well, not something I knew how to repair, cared to repair. Blue tarped it, waited a couple of weeks, and had a contractor come in to fix it. But that's the last time I'll try to replace a window.
That sounds about right. Jim, what about yourself?
All right. I know we were short on time. I've got two because they were both projects that actually went well and had a ironic twist at the end. So the first one was a garage floor that I put in. I was in love with this garage floor. It looked completely pro. And in preparation for this call, we had a call with Morey and pulled up Zillow, went to the old house that I owned, and they had pictures of the garage floor, right? And that was the ironic twist. It's like, I love that garage floor. Now it's somebody else's. The other one was kind of the total opposite, which was when I was in my 20s, I really wasn't thinking like, yeah, I'm buying this house. I'm going to have to sell it. What I should do is make investments that somebody else would want. Instead, I said, it's my house. I want to do the things that are going to make me happy. I love the Southwest, but I lived in central New Jersey. So on the interior of the house, we did all these Southwest type designs. The color scheme was Southwest, like the Slick Rock, and just think of the Slick Rock in like Bryce National Park or Zion National Park. Really cool stuff. Had some tile done in that style. And when we went to sell the house, we had the realtor kind of walk through and was like, well, it's like, I guess it doesn't make sense to rip all this out. And we're like, rip it all out. We thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And, the realtor was just like, okay, we'll make do.
For some reason, I'm picturing like a Chili's or something like that.
Terracotta floors.
Like. Yeah.
It was like a Mexican restaurant. Yeah.
That's a good one. Well, usually I have something to add to this, and I'll tell you, I have zero to add when it comes to home improvement because I am not home improvement whatsoever. I am a proud contributor to our local pro economy and taking care of those sorts of things. So I'll leave it to you guys to be the handy ones. I'll build a computer, set up a website, edit a podcast before I do any of that type of stuff. So my hat's off to you. I'm very envious of folks who have that capability.
Well, I'll tell you, the best thing that you could ever do is put speakers in every room in the house with a centralized amp. That's the best.
Now you're talking. I guess my home improvement story is really just running Cat 5 to rooms and then using Mocha adapters to take advantage of old cable outlets to make them wired. So
there's I might have to hit you up on that. I might have to.
That shows you where my head's at. It's all about the computer. Okay. Well, I think that's a good spot we can leave it. Before we go, though, any final thoughts, Morey, on kind of the conversation here today? I know you kind of gave some tips for folks on what they should be doing now, but any last words of wisdom for the audience before we let you go?
Not really. Just it's been a pleasure speaking with both of you today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you so much, Morey. Jim, how about yourself? Final thoughts for this week?
Oh, the way we met Morey was through LinkedIn, reaching out. He was very open to making the connection, building his network. I would encourage everyone, reach out, connect with me, Jeff. I know Morey's open to that as well because I, have firsthand experience with it. So, it's how we keep finding fantastic guests to be on this podcast. People like Morey, people like Darren Rolls, we talked about earlier. Be out there, build your network.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, we're always happy to talk with folks, and tell us if there's topics you want us to talk about here in the podcast. Just hit us up on LinkedIn. We're always good for that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and leave it. We'll have a bunch of links in the show notes. Links to LinkedIn for the three of us. I'll put a link to Morey and his different books, identity/asset/privilege/ at some point, cloud attack vectors, which will all be out there. And then also you can learn more about BeyondTrust at beyondtrust.com. So I'll have a link to that, as well as the NIST 800-207 that Morey is referring to. It is a very good, and it is a very readable document. I will concur on that one. Not as dry or droll as some other NIST documents that might be out there. So you can find us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we will go ahead and leave it. Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.